from the Department of Art and Critical Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, and she will be speaking to us about desert time, the silence at the heart of apocalypse. Elena.
A voice cries out in the desert, shattering the stillness. Long after the voice dies out, the sound remains caught as an impression in the silence, as if waiting for its echo to circle back, to break it out of stillness once again. The desert, as a physical space, is inextricably bound to its apocalyptic or revelatory temporality. Many who have entered the desert, prophets, mystics, and artists alike, have done so seeking communion with time, and perhaps even an experience of how time is revealed to itself. Denis Surratt writes in Death and the Dreamer an account of a conversation with a monk from the north of France. Surratt's impression of him is that of a priest in some long-drowned temple, isolated and timeless. The monk identifies in Surratt a lack of understanding, but a certain capacity to listen, and so he speaks to him frankly. He divulges his conception of the mystery of time and its revelatory unfolding. He goes on to say that time began 9 months before the birth of Christ and ended in the same moment. But that it made, so to speak, a great deal of noise in all directions. He continues, stating that the predominant linear conception of time was in fact an attempt to order the infinite shattering out of the primordial moment, which continues to expand into the future as into the past. The philosophical implications of the monk's concept of time are vast, and to look at them through the frame of the desert, apocalyptic temporality, and the work of art, is to begin with the center of time and unfold it from that point in terms of rhythm and repetition, with attention to a certain linguistic or spatio-linguistic dimension within time. Time, when isolated beyond human frames, can be both constant and ephemeral, still and rhythmic. The undifferentiation of the atemporal dimension of the desert gives birth to rhythm, which relates everything back to the center. If time unfolds from a primordial point of origin flowing backwards and forwards, how does it unfold and what is revealed? Can the primordial structure of the work of art unlock, through this same rhythm, the desert as a space for divine repetition? The primordial as something to hold as a telos, both for the work of art and as an experience of time, is characteristically elusive and unknowable beyond its shadow. It does not merely underlie time, rather it generates it continually, and because it operates outside of time, it begins and concludes in one simultaneous moment beyond measure. It is only through the separation of moments, through rhythm and repetition, that we become aware of its unfolding through time. And conversely, time becomes aware of its own unfolding in a similar way, chiefly through revelatory repetition, wherein rhythm-engendering moments reflect back to their source. This relational system is a sort of self-negating entropy, and the system culminates and concludes in this compounding of awareness. In Thesis 16 on the concept of history, Walter Benjamin states that the present is not a transition between moments. Rather, time originates and reaches a standstill in the experience of the present. Instead of an eternal past depicted as linear, we need a ruptural experience of particular moments which stand out. Time and truth are often yoked together, and it is through time that truth, in the Platonic sense of aletheia, is unhidden. An issue arises when time as an actuality is subsumed into time as history. Historical understanding is often caught between two poles, that of progress and that of the past. While most Occidental concepts of time, stemming from Aristotle, are linear, cumulative, and designate the eternal to its own realm beyond the present, they also tend to give primacy to either the future or the past as a zenith towards which human activity has and must comport itself. Neither models are built towards the primordial, which constitutes aletheia and which underlies and is in turn masked and revealed by time. Through a flattening of time wherein individual moments are subsumed into linear culminations and contorted through illusory representation, the primordial is either seen as that which can be surpassed in the pursuit of progress, or conversely, it is sought, but ultimately lost to history. And the loss actually occurs when it becomes located in empty ideas of history rather than outside of it in unhiddenness. For Benjamin, the end of history was to be defined by a return to a messianic and apocalyptic understanding of world events, the approach of which is juxtaposed to the empty resolution of history. The idea of the messianic is actually cognate with that of repetition in the sense that the latter feeds into the former. So before delving into repetition as an ecstatic experience of the primordial within the present, it is important to note that profane repetition also occurs. The critical theorist Baudrillard was preoccupied with the illusion of reality cast by the processional repetition of simulacra. In Baudrillard's model, a simulation of reality is repeated until nothing remains of the original but profane illusion, precisely because of the need to designate meaning and cumulative substance to it, which compounds the emptiness of history. It is important to note that the concept of simulacra was borrowed from the writer and philosopher Klosowski, who defined it as that which actualizes and communicates the incommunicable. In the work of art, simulacrum is capable of communicating the incommunicable without reducing it to empty illusion. Now, this is due to the suspension of the numinous thing as signified beyond its material signifier in the work of art. The noumenon expressed is more than the sum of its material parts, so Gestalt, and avoids materialization and conceptualization because it cannot be fully grasped by the mind and cannot exist in its entirety in any form materially. Instead, it's actually preserved in a state of limitlessness before taking on meaning, while still retaining its imposed meaning in simulacrum. Just as the impression of a voice crying out in the desert is preserved in silence. While Baudrillard's repetition acts as more of a distorting mirror, Klosowski's acts as an antechamber, encapsulating the originary unknown. True repetition is one means by which the primordial is revealed and brought into ruptural action. Its capacity lies in how it displaces revelatory moments out of the flatness of history and into the ecstatic present beyond the so-called vulgar present. Kierkegaard, when writing about his concept of repetition, made an important distinction between it and recollection. So Plato designated recollection as the means by which knowledge should be obtained. He posited that the rudiments of all knowledge are already in the possession of the learner through the inherited structure of the mind. For Plato, all learning was merely exercised remembering. Now, repetition is different because while repetition and recollection are of one analogous internal movement, they form in opposite directions. The difference in directionality is because what is recollected has already been and is thus repeated backwards, whereas genuine repetition is repeated forwards. And the teleology and result of repetition is towards an ecstatic union with temporality, wherein what is revealed appears like an arrow from the unknown. While what is revealed through repetition was in fact always there, it does not appear that way to the recipient of the vision. It almost appears as a revelation from the future. Seurat's monk concludes that the only conceivable way for one to contribute to creation is through unknowing. This unknowing echoes through the desert in repetition. The artist and time itself are united and made new in the momentary unknowing of repetition. Now, there is actually a grammatical peculiarity, I find, in Revelations chapter 1, verse 1 and 2 that illustrates this perfectly. It takes the form of a threefold vagueness of subject placement that is maintained in all translations. After careful reading, it becomes unclear whether Christ is revealing himself, being revealed to himself, or if his revelation is being revealed. This peculiarity is in fact echoed through the text and points to an intentional threefold meaning. The center of time, Christ in this case, is revealed and has the revelation of himself revealed to himself. At the heart of this is his own momentary unknowing. The moment of self-reflexive revelation lifts Christ out of time, as the primordial becomes aware of itself through subjectivity. History becomes ecstatic through ecstatic revelation. While the primordial is transcendental and pre-incarnate, through translation it becomes a dialectic between the eternal and the subjective, the momentary and the historical. As with each revelatory repetition, truth is lifted out of its homogeneous lineage and made new. It is through repetition that history is rescued, is lifted out of self-distance and alienation, and brought into the future. As Heidegger states in The Essence of Truth, true historical return is a decisive beginning of futurity. Profane repetition exists without, and divine repetition within the work of art, as in the desert. In this space only is Baudrillard's dualism torn apart. Now, Baudrillard could actually be viewed as a transcendentalist who desired to capture things in the state before they took on meaning, which is exactly what true repetition does, if it can be achieved or even imagined. So if repetition occurs within the desert through the experience of those who enter it, then the desert itself as a modality constitutes rhythm. The desert as a physical place has the unique capacity to be a facilitator of an apocalyptic experience of time. For Seurat's monk, each repetition occurred simultaneously as a radial expansion, emanating from Christ outwards into the past as into the future as experienced. The revelations of the artist became points of repetition within the plane they inhabit, each time renewing history from the center out. If this temporality is poised between acceleration and deceleration, then physical law dictates that what is left is stillness. Now, what exists within between that stillness is rhythm. Agamben wrote about rhythm in Man Without Content, spiraling out from a quote by Holderlin during his years of supposed insanity. In his bed, he proclaimed that everything is rhythm, the entire destiny of man is one heavenly rhythm. And just as every work of art is one rhythm, and everything swings from the poetizing lips of the god. This rhythm, Agamben extrapolates, is that which grants the work of art its space in the originary, and also constitutes the originary space itself. Therefore, rhythm has the dual function of making something what it is and also constituting the greater, more universal other, which makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Rhythm, then, also imparts structure, yet the structure it imparts is not a movement from undifferentiation to order. Instead of ordering time, it introduces into the eternal flow a split and a stop. Therefore, it structures time atemporally, from the center out. Just as the modality of the desert constitutes rhythm, all poiesis constitutes rhythm, and individual works constitute repetition. Mallarme was a great poet of the center. For Mallarme, everything in the world existed to end up in a book, and further, nothing could exist outside of the book. His life, in turn, was consecrated to the sole task of writing Le Livre, and thus preserving the immortal and pure word. Mallarme, like Benjamin and Scholem, divided language into the profane and divine. Who divided language into the profane and the divine, made a distinction between absolute language and a lower, more inessential language. Now, to give this language a lower designation is not to lambast it for its uselessness. Rather the opposite, for within the inessential is contained the absolute through lack and absence. For Mallarme, language is no mere signifier of meaning, but rather it destroys its object and becomes the signified. Language does not only disclose a distorted image of the immortal and perfect word, it contains it through negation. The immortal word is situated beyond language, yet must stay manifested within it in order to not lose what cannot be found outside of its boundaries. For Mallarme, the purpose of language was to be both meaningful and abstract. Authentic language has the dual and paradoxical function of representation and vanquishment of its object. Maurice Blanchot, writing about Mallarme, spoke of the silenced object, which in its absence reveals the sign of something else, of truth in the classical sense. End quote. In The Dice Throw, which is a poem by Mallarme, the words and what they carry destroy and fall in and out of the physical pages, leaving impressions seen only through the translucency of the paper. Another reminder of the impression of the desert vocalization in silence. Blanchot explains that for Mallarme, each poem was engaged in the creation of language itself, just as for Hölderlin, each work of art was of one rhythm. The book in this case has the same resonance as the desert. It contains within it, in a spatio-linguistic dimension, the immortal word, and through it, the center of time. It must be noted that for Walter Benjamin, while creation occurs spatially and revelation occurs temporally, the messianic operates as both the culmination and completion of both spatial and temporal dimensions. Walter Benjamin's messianism has a largely linguistic dimension, the word being the ultimate dialectical paradox. The word existed before creation itself as the transcendental self-reflection of God. This is displayed clearly in Genesis 2:19, where God asks that Adam name his creations. The transition from the infinite word of God to the finite word of man is a movement from a creating word to a naming word, and later, after the fall, from the divine word to the profane. As the desert engenders repetition, the name of God becomes unpronounceable, meaningless, and inexpressible, while simultaneously creating all meaning. Within the linguistic dimension, all is contained: the template, the originary, its self-reflection as logos, the procession of manifestation, and its illusory shadow. The linguistic dimension imbues meaning through its deconstruction. In the fullness of language and time, we return once again to the voice in the desert, which, for now, is human. A voice like that of Agnes Martin, who left New York in 1967 in pursuit of silence and solitude in the New Mexico desert. Deeply affected by the death of her friend and contemporary, Ad Reinhardt, she took a hiatus from painting before settling down in the desert and resuming her practice. Choosing to paint with her back to the world, her paintings came as visions. She would spend weeks in silence awaiting the return of a glimpse, which she would then meticulously translate to the canvas, taking the form of 72 by 72 and 60 by 60 squares, imperial system, and painted intuitively, with mathematical accuracy and without the aid of a ruler. Agnes Martin's paintings are both literally and symbolically repetition within the desert. Her non-desire to intellectualize is an internal movement through unknowing, towards a repetition which recollects forward. Each work is of one rhythm, emanating from the same core internal structure, but with infinite variations. Each work reveals the same vision of primordial and transcendental ecstasies. Agnes Martin once stated that Mark Rothko reached zero so that nothing could stand in the way of the truth. And if Rothko's vision reached zero, then Agnes's vision reaches through zero and beyond it to one, to truth in repetition. To finish, the poetizer is the receiver of the vision, a vision which is repetition. The act of poesis is one in which the primordial is lifted out of time and made new. At the heart of such a revelation of primordial and unhidden truth is the principle of unknowing, as what is contained in a fragment of unhidden truth is all that can be afforded. If any more were to be revealed at once and through anything other than unknowing, it would cease to be absolute. As the monk departed, he envied Seurat's ignorance, for in such unknowing is time created eternally. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Questions for Elena? Yes, Eleanor.
I'm wondering if you have thought about this also in terms of Robert Smithson, another artist who was kind of very closely tied to the desert, and whose work is also about kind of these different orders of time. On the one hand, you know, he is very sort of connected to the notion of entropy, but
yes,
also there's a kind of cyclical quality. He talks about how remote pasts meet remote futures in his work, and his things like spiral jetties seem to exist really in, you know, two different orders of time at once. And I'm wondering if you've thought about him in connection with your thesis.
Definitely in relation to the notion of entropy and sort of the self-negating entropy, but I think that his entropy almost, perhaps I'm wrong and perhaps I'm misinterpreting him, but it almost doesn't have a teleology towards reunification. It almost goes towards entropy and then towards entropy and towards entropy. But I see it as sort of moving through that entropy, and the entropy has a teleology back towards union, towards sort of a self-negation, towards. There is a yes, absolutely, with Smithson, absolutely. But I'm referring more to his writings, which sort of, I think his work does that. I think that his work shows the unification, but perhaps in his writing he tends to. But I was sort of influenced by him in regards to the entropic. Yeah.
So the reason why we're using microphones, I should explain, is because people are watching online and they can't hear us unless we've got a microphone. So I'm not being pedantic, honestly. Any other questions for Elena? Yes, Alfredo.
Thank you, Elena, for the paper, which was very complicated, and it had a lot of crossing references. Actually, I admit I got lost a bit in the middle of it.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. It's I was intrigued by the idea of the spatial notion that you presented,
right,
in relation to the desert and the work of Agnes Martin. I was a bit more confused about the idea of time that you presented. Because maybe I misread it, but it kind of I perceive it as almost as a notion of time, which is detached from us, as in using time in a certain way.
Right.
And I mean, for me personally, I mean, now I am your time and you are my time. So to me, I felt a bit of a kind of a detachment in your paper. I was just wondering if you can expand a bit more on it.
Right. So I am talking about nonlinear time because, of course, we are so sort of tuned into this notion of linear time in our daily lives. It's a heuristic. It's one that we all follow. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I'm saying that the type of time that I'm looking at is time that has rifts, time that is broken, time that returns back, because time in and of itself is, of course, not linear. Time in and of itself, I sort of view it as being radial, as being a radial expansion, as I spoke about in the beginning with the monk's notion of time. So it is involved with humanity. It is involved with human sort of activity, in the sense that these visions, these occurrences, these atemporal occurrences, actually unite our time, our current time, the day-to-day, the sort of profane time with divine time, with this sort of transcendental time beyond time, if that makes any sense.
No, that's okay. I have to think about it.
Sorry.
Any other comments? Yeah.
Sorry, just following on from that then, I'm just interested, do you see all visionary experiences then as atemporal, as somehow happening outside of time?
Yes, I do. I see them as coming from outside of time, and of course any sort of... There's a notion of translation that I touched on briefly, where they are funneled through a human being. They are funneled through a political situation. They are funneled through an entire field of worldly occurrences, and they all sort of, but the seed, the core, is still contained. It's the immortal word preserving itself in the profane word. So the vision is a translation. The vision is not a direct translation even, but it still contains sort of the whole of the initial, that fragment. It's basically, what I'm talking about is sort of a fragment of God revealing itself, and the teleology of that fragment revealing itself. An unknowable teleology, I have to note. But actually, I think that it's the absence that contains the fragment most fully. It's not the presence of the immortal word or the divine word in the profane word, or the presence of the initial vision, of the true vision, in the vision that is experienced. It's actually the absence of it. It's sort of like a differential equation, if you want to look at it that way. It's containing it through negation, through absence, through lack. It's the spaces that are left behind that actually contain the totality, if that answered the question.
So the source of the vision is atemporal, outside time, but the vision itself, because it's mediated through a human, necessarily has to take place in time?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Larry.
Thank you, Elena. It's very beautiful and very clear.
Thank you.
As I was listening to you, I just thought perhaps you were influenced somewhat by Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who, the second series, because that's all about time. He's a time traveler. His wonderful visuals, the whole cast and crew are just always talking about time. And where they go, they meet the characters that we see in literature and in art, and they muck with them. They mess with them. And they say that they're not doing it, but they are doing it. And does that popularize the poesis of the temporal and bring it to the popular audience so that they understand kind of the long-range potential for the more you understand time, the more you watch and see and hear and understand?
Yes, I think that on one hand, I mean, it's a really interesting point you bring up, but, well, not but, and, sorry. However, it's a concept that almost doesn't need to be popularized because it's so there. So yes, it is popularized. I think that it is sort of made more accessible and more palatable in a sense, but I think it's something that we all experience. And yes, exactly. I think that we translate it, we popularize it in moments, and not just even beyond art, beyond. It's basically that those atemporal moments. I mean, time wouldn't exist without the rifts in time. So.
Okay. Unless there's another question, we're going to break for lunch. Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sandwiches are next door, everyone. We're going to reconvene in an hour at 1 o'clock for Michelle Fletcher. So see you in an hour.